Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Policy on Writing Policies. I'm Lois Engström, the Marketing Manager here at ClauseMatch, and today I'm joined by my colleague Danny Gao and GRC pundit Michael Rasmussen. I assume most of you know about Michael already, but for those of you who don't, Michael is an internationally recognized pundit on governance, risk management and compliance. Michael helps organizations improve GRC processes, design and implement GRC architectures, and select solutions that are effective, efficient, and agile. He is a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor, and is noted as the father of GRC, being the first to define and model the GRC market in February 2002 whilst at Forrester Research. Today, Michael will detail the components of a policy on writing policies of why a policy on writing policies is needed in your organization, who is involved in writing and enforcing the policy on writing policies, what is included in the policy on writing policies, how the policy on writing policies is used and enforced. So now I'm going to hand it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Lois. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about a critical element in policy management in organizations, the foundation that is, and that's the policy on writing policies. Let's start with the first slide here. Now, I don't need to explain the present circumstances to anybody out there. Can we move to the next slide? We're in the midst of a lot of chaos, and organizations suffer a lot of change minute by minute, second by second. You got volumes of regulatory change, business change, risk change, and that's just during the course of normal business. You deal with something like the pandemic and the global crisis right now, and change is happening at a much more rapid pace. As we adjust business processes and work from home policies and all the things that relate to that, like home expense policies and everything else, there's a lot that has to adapt and change right now. Now, it's critical in this context that the organization has some type of structured approach to policy management. It's important that the organization does so under normal business conditions, but even more so under conditions of chaos and crisis and pandemic. We need a clear understanding on who can write policies, who can approve those policies, how are those policies communicated, how are they published and maintained, how are they written, and what type of style and language. That all gets back to what we're going to talk about today in the policy on writing policies. It helps the organization navigate chaos in the course of normal business, but more particularly right now in the midst of a pandemic and crisis. I was talking to one organization that found that they had over 20 different policy portals across their organization, this large financial services firm. Now, in a time of crisis and pandemic, in the midst of chaos, having 20 different policy portals is ineffective, inefficient, and at the heart of the point today, certainly unagile as we try to navigate chaos. We need to have that singular point of reference of what all the policies are in the organizations, which ones are changing, what needs to be communicated to individuals. It's important that we get a handle on policies. But not only are policies often scattered across multiple portals, like in that one organization with over 20 different policy portals, but policies are written in different formats and structures and templates, and they look different. In that context, a lot of organizations don't even know what policies they have, because all these different departments are responsible for their own area of policies, and nobody even has a master list of what all the policies are. So let's explore and unpack this a little bit more in the next slide. So organizations are dealing with a lot of regulatory and legal change. Volumes and volumes of new laws and regulations, enforcement actions, proposed regulations, and so forth. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But at the same time, we have a volume of external risk changes in the market conditions and economic conditions that impact our policies, geopolitical risks that are all around us right now, competitive industry needs, society, shifts in technology as we adapt to work from home environments and things with the current pandemic. We got changes to our internal business, shifts in strategy and processes, and how those processes are evolving and changing as regulators update their guidance on what's expected in business processes to adapt to the crisis. And which of those regulatory new regulations or change regulations and things are temporary and which ones are permanent. We need to be able to understand as they impact business processes and shifts in technology. We have a different working environment and workforce, but we're still bringing on new employees in some areas of the organization, and people are shifting roles and sharing responsibilities. Things are shifting, and people need to be more aware of policies as they adapt and support the business in a very different environment right now. And we got a wide array of third-party relationships, the vendors and suppliers and outsourcers and service providers and contractors and consultants and temporary workers that we have to interact with. And all these things require an understanding of policies. Now, just being knowledgeable about the law and regulation isn't enough. I can devote a ton of resources to understanding the laws and regulations and enforcement actions, but that doesn't make me compliant if our policies aren't in sync and people aren't aware of the policies or they're not following the policies. The challenge here is that we have to be able to keep all of this in sync, the legal and regulatory change, the risk change, and the business change, and make sure our policies are correct for the particular environment from a legal and regulatory risk and business context. And not only that the policies are correct, but they are understood and enforced and people have access to them. Next slide, please. This becomes particularly challenging in today's modern environment in which you have a volume and volumes of legal and regulatory change. Global financial services firms are dealing with 220 regulatory change events every business day. This is a Thomson Reuters figure here. Every business day, there's 220 regulatory change events coming from 982 regulators around the world. It could be a new law or regulation, a change law or regulation, an enforcement action. All these impact the organization. And as there's a change in law, regulation, enforcement action, we need to understand, are our policies current for our environment? Does a policy need to be revised or changed? Or do we need to communicate a policy and make people aware of a specific risk area because there's just an enforcement action on one of our big competitors and we might be the next one? We have to keep up with all this change. In the next slide. So organizations have to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. That individual policy and how it's written and how it addresses what risks and regulations, but also the interconnectedness of policies. What are all my accounting policies? What are all my market conduct policies? What are all my IT security policies? Particularly in today's environment, what are all the policies that remote office workers need to be aware of? And how have those changed to adapt to the current crisis? We need to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. The interconnectedness of policies across the organization. That becomes critical. And so in that context, on the next slide, what hinders organizations is trying to manage all these policies in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, where there's a mountain of paperwork, where it takes 200 employee hours to build that report for senior executives and management at the end of the year, because they got to go through all the documents, spreadsheets, and emails for policies and other compliance purposes and tabulate and correlate and add up information. That's not managing compliance. That's reacting. What happened to 11 months ago, we started to see this trend in policy issues and things we don't become aware of until 11 months later when we build that report. And documents, spreadsheets, and emails lack any type of defined audit trail and system of record. That we can say that person opened and read that policy on that date and time, was fully aware of what was expected of them, and still chose to do something bad, or made a misstep. Documents, spreadsheets, and emails do not have the proper record trail and evidence needed to be able to defend the organization. They slow the organization down, and you get policies that are stored in files and like document files and things that are out of date. You have unauthorized policies and everything else. On the next slide, we explore this further, where we have too many people sending too many messages in too many ways. The worker there in the middle says, there are too many people from too many departments sending too many different messages about too many policies. I can't make sense of it all or keep myself organized. Because like that one financial services organization I referenced, there's over 20 different policy portals. And policies look different in each of the portals. And they have a different language style that they're written in and different template. and they use terms inconsistently. And that all confuses the workforce. It's like Hercules battling the Hydra. Hercules had many battles to fight. One was against the multi-headed dragon, the Hydra, and you cut off one of its heads and multiple heads grows up in its place. You know, that's the challenge of policy management right now when we're trying to deal with policies across all these different departments that are going in their own direction for policy management. It's like a multi-headed dragon, the Hydra. We need a consistent approach to policies where every policy is defined, documented, indexed, properly cataloged, that is, and is in the same template and in the same writing style. That becomes important in that there's one portal for policies. And the policy and writing policies we'll talk about in a few minutes is there to achieve that. But in the next slide, it's important to understand that the way policy management is today is like the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. The Winchester Mystery House is built in the 1800s. It cost $5.5 million to build in the 1800s. That's one expensive house today when you calculate inflation. It had 147 different builders. It took 38 years to build, but it had no design, no blueprint, no architect. And at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense. It has staircases that go up or down to nowhere, doors that open to walls, doors that open to 20-foot drops, skylights that are in floors instead of ceilings. The Winchester Mystery House is most likely your policy management program in your organization. That over the last 38 years, you've had 147 different builders of policy in your organization, between human resources and accounting and corporate compliance and ethics and legal and IT security and on and on and on. You've got all these different departments doing policies in their own way, and it doesn't make sense. And they're in different formats and templates. You got 20 different policy portals or more than 20 different policy portals. And it's a maze of confusion. And the average employee doesn't have a go-to place to find the policies that relate to their job across the organization. And in a time of crisis like what's upon us now, you know, there's multiple paths of communication, things get confused, and risk exposure just grows and abounds. We have to overcome this wild west of policy management, the Winchester Mystery House. So let's review some of the challenges on policy management in the next slide. So what are the challenges I see organizations facing? Well, first off, it's the volume of legal and regulatory change. The 220 regulatory change events every business day in financial services, for example. Changes in the risk environment, like the current crisis and pandemic, and how it impacts policies. The economic situation right now and how it impacts policies. Changes in the business as we adapt to a remote workforce right now, like home office expense policies and things like that. You know, trying to keep up with legal, regulatory, risk, business change is a significant challenge for policy management. Then you have the issue of rogue policies. Anybody can open up a word processor and write a document and call it a policy. But is it really a policy? Now we need to be careful because a policy establishes a legal duty of care upon the organization. I can think of a very large retailer and they have a policy management strategy right now because they have the concern that any store manager can open up a word processor, write a document and call it a policy, putting a legal duty of care upon the retailer. You know, if some customer or employee is harmed and it comes back that that store manager said this was a policy, that can be used against them. You have rogue policies, policies that are being written that aren't authorized and they're not official policies of the organization. One financial services firm I talked to found that they had their anti-money laundering policy, but had a division that didn't like it and took out the parts they didn't like and added to it. Rogue policy. It was not an official policy at that point. You have out-of-date policies, policies that have been written 5-6 years ago, maybe even more, that aren't current for the current environment. You have policies in different templates and formats, policies that lack any type of owner, policies that are poorly written, you know, in which they are written in the passive voice and not the active voice, with long, complex paragraphs. I can think of a supply chain code of conduct for a global firm that I reviewed. It was going out to an audience at the time where it was an international audience. It was only being published in English, and most of the readers had English as a second language. And in that context of this supply chain code of conduct, it was written in the passive voice and not the active voice, with long, complex paragraphs. And therefore, we're right. Just the way we write this policy means we're making it more difficult for the audience to read. If we would have written just in the active voice with clear language and shorter sentences and paragraphs, it's much more clear to understand and apply to an audience that has English as a second language. And what really confused people was the first paragraph says, company believes, and the second paragraph says, company strongly believes. So we have different levels of belief in the supply chain code of conduct. That's not what they're trying to communicate. It was careless writing. But somebody that has English as a second language is going to interpret every word and think that that second paragraph is more important than the first paragraph. And that was not their point. We also have the challenge of the lack of defensibility. Who read what policy and what date and time? Who acknowledged the policy, certified, read and understood, attested to it? Did they answer the questions right? Do we know that they understood the policy? In today's organization, we need to have a clear, defensible audit trail around our policies of what was the policy at that point in time, who read it and who understood it. Now, the whole purpose of the policy and writing policies is to overcome these policy management challenges. It's to help us keep policies current in the midst of legal, regulatory risk, and business change, to combat rogue policies so that we know what's an official policy and how it's managed in the organization and who can improve them, to be able to have a life cycle to keep policies current and not out of date, and that the policies are in the right template and they have an owner and that they're written correctly in the right language style and have the right audit trail and records as they're being managed properly in the organization. The policy on policies is there to be able to overcome these policy management challenges. Next slide, please. So when we look at policies, it's important to understand that policies are not just compliance documents. Now, most of the enterprise policy management strategies that I interact on, like 90% of them, they're being led out of corporate compliance and ethics for the organizations that are trying to get a singular view into all the policies of the organization. But this just doesn't mean that they're just compliance documents. They are also governance documents. I can think of organizations like Starbucks and Suncor Energies. They call their policy management program their governance documents program. The policies help us to reliably achieve the objectives of the organization. So they're very clearly governance documents to help us reliably achieve those objectives, whether they're entity level objectives, division, department level objectives, process, asset, project level objectives. Policies are there to help us reliably achieve objectives in the organizations. But policies are also risk documents. The very fact that we have a policy means that somebody's identified a risk. There wouldn't be a policy unless there was a risk, and that risk was significant enough that we had to write down rules of behavior to be able to control and address this risk and define it in a policy. So policies are governance documents, risk management documents, and compliance documents, GRC. Policies help us reliably achieve objectives while addressing uncertainty, that's risk, and act with integrity, that's the compliance, in and across the organization. Next slide, please. So this means that we should have a federated approach to policy management. Now, I like the term federated over centralized. Now, a lot of these enterprise policy management programs, as I mentioned, I see being led out of corporate compliance and ethics. But it's not that corporate compliance and ethics is the sole group involved in policy management. They might be leading the strategy, but there's a lot of other departments responsible for policy management that are involved, whether it's human resources, accounting and finance, operational risk, market conduct, IT security, physical security, you name it. There's a lot of different departments that are involved in policy management. Because corporate compliance and ethics is the most often the department leading this, does not necessarily mean that they're the sole owner of it, though. It's a federated approach that involves collaboration and cooperation across a range of departments in the organization. And that's why I call it federated over centralized policy management. But so that we can get the different departments to work together in policy management and provide a shared services approach in technology and infrastructure. Next slide, please. This means that we need to be able to start with an understanding of where our policies are. This is challenging. I was talking to one healthcare organization in the United States that because of all the mergers and acquisitions, they've acquired nearly 30 hospitals over 20 years, and they found out that they had 18,000 policy and procedure documents. That's a mess. That's a maze. Another healthcare organization I was talking to in New York State said we can beat that. We have 21,000 policies and procedures, and we're trying to get down to 5,000. I can think of a global financial services firm that went to my policy management workshop last May, just about a year ago. And they came out of it and their corporate compliance function said, we need an enterprise approach to policy management. But our challenge is we're a global financial services firm. We don't even know what policies we have. And so they did a policy discovery process in North America and found 1,200 policies in North America. And then now they're working on that policy discovery process in Europe and Asia right now. But how do we go out there and define and understand what policies we have across our organization is one of the foundational points of being able to address this problem. Next slide, please. From there, we need a top-down approach. This all comes together and helps us define what we're going to talk about in that meta policy, the policy on writing policies. And so we need that top-down approach and strategy that brings the organization together. And so it starts with the policy management strategy, which gets into a charter, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. And that brings the different departments that are responsible for issuing policies together in the organization. From there, we define consistent policy management processes. And this is supporting the policy management life cycle that gets defined in the meta policy, the policy on writing policies. This might be a layered and structured approach because you might be a global organization with different divisions and you might be writing policies in 8 different languages, like one global professional services firm I worked with on their enterprise policy management strategy. Or you could be some of the global banks or even consumer packaged good firms I've worked with that are writing policies in over 20 languages. This can require layers of structure and process and strategy. But it starts with the overall strategy, moves into the processes of the life cycle of policies, and then the information technology architecture that can support that and enable it. Next slide, please. To build this federated approach, we need to have integrated information where corporate compliance, risk, human resources, legal, the line of business, finance and accounting, IT security, IT in general, can all come together and work on a singular strategy for risk-aware creation of policies and procedures and maintaining them in the environment. We need to clearly understand who currently owns which policies, how do we prioritize policies, how are resources currently aligned to address policies, are our significant risk areas covered in policies, is there duplication in policies and redundancy, are there gaps? And the policy on writing policies is there to address and be able to manage all this consistently in the organization so that the organization has a singular go-to place for managing policies to make sure people understand who can write a policy, how is it approved in the organization, and how it is implemented. On the next slide, here I talk about governing what policies the organization has. Now, so from here, we're going to start getting to some of the details on the policy and writing policies. And I do have some examples of policies and writing policies, or what some people call a meta policy, that I'm happy to forward to somebody if somebody wants to email me on that. But we need to establish a policy management organizational structure where there's clearly defined authority for identifying and creating policies. That's one of the key elements on the policy and policies is defining who can write a policy in the organization. And how is it approved? And how is it monitored and managed and maintained in the organization? And all that becomes documented in that policy and writing policies. We need to determine what policies are required, by law and regulation, and be able to map our policies to the laws and regulations out there. Determine what other policies are needed to reliably achieve the objectives of the organization and address the risks and uncertainty. Determine which types of policies must apply to vendors or partners and in what circumstances. Determine gaps, redundancies, overlaps in existing policies. Document, define policy owners and map the policies that those owners own. And establish a methodology and triggers to update policies and keep them current, to be able to maintain them in the environment. We'll talk about that in a few slides. And have a consistent policy template. Next slide, please. Now, it's important to note as we look on the policy and writing policies, and I do have some examples, but there's not a one size fits all here. What is needed in a policy and writing policies for a domestic organization just operating in one country in one language is going to look different from a policy and writing policies that has a very layered approach to policy management, because it's a conglomerate with lots of different divisions and subsidiaries and is managing policies in a variety of different languages and things like that. that becomes critical. You might have an overall code of conduct and things for your organization, but you might be a large organization. Pick somebody like a Sony, for example. And I'm not talking about anything specific I know of at Sony, but you might have a code of conduct for Sony overall. But in that context, you might have Sony Music, it might have elements of a code of conduct that apply to the music industry that's just different from Sony on the electronics manufacturing area. And so a large organization with global, diversified, distributed businesses, is going to have layers of policy management and is going to have a program that fits their model and need that's going to be different from a small manufacturer or retailer or small bank or credit union or building and loan society, whatever it might be, that is much more just domestic focus and doesn't have that same level of complexity. And so the policy and writing policies, while I talk about it theoretically in today's presentation, it's going to be different for different types of organizations and fit their culture and need for a policy. You need a suitable and scalable system that adapts to your particular organization. Next slide, please. Now, the foundation for any policy and writing policies happens even before writing the policy and policies. And it gets into a policy management charter. If we're going to have a collaboration and cooperation across several different departments on policy management, it's necessary that we have some type of charter in place that establishes that policy management committee or steering committee, governance council, whatever you want to call it. And that charter should be clearly spelled out. And in that charter, there should be a vision and mission statement of what policy management is, its scope and what it's trying to achieve, the accountability reporting structures, the roles and groups involved, the policy management life cycle. And then all of this gets defined in the meta policy, that policy and writing policies, and the related resources of a style guide, templates, and forms in the organization as well. Next slide, please. So the policy on writing policies is going to clearly define the organizational roles. One of those roles is that steering committee for policies. The policy steering committee, some call it the policy governance council, but whatever you call it, there's some type of steering committee that has a representation of the different departments involved in the enterprise policy management strategy. And the policy on writing policies defines the roles and responsibilities of the steering committee to govern the policy management program, approve policy templates, guidance, and procedures, review and revise the program as needed to reflect changes in the environment, and includes the different representatives from the different departments involved in policy issuance. And then the policy on policies clearly defines that policy program manager, that individual that is the central hub for making sure that policies are consistent, effective, and agile in the organization. They manage the policy development process, guide policy owners and developers, oversees policy approval committees, and chairs and facilitates a steering committee. Now, what's important to note is that the policy program manager is not responsible for writing the policies. In fact, at one global retailer I worked with, that policy program manager, and in this case, her name is Barbara, Barbara told me that the only policy she ever wrote was the policy and writing policies. So the very policy we're talking about today was the only policy she actually ever wrote. But every policy went through her to make sure that it was conformed to the policy management process, the policy and writing policies, used the proper templates and style guides. She managed the process, but the only policy she actually owned and authored herself was the policy and writing policies. And that's the role of the policy program manager. Then you have the role of a policy owner. The policy owner is often the risk owner. If this policy is violated, who's responsible? Who's accountable? The policy owner ensures that each policy remains accurate and relevant, has established plan for policy communication and training, evaluates changes and factors affecting each policy, and oversees revision or decisions to retire each policy. Now, again, the policy and writing policies defines this policy steering committee. It defines the policy program manager role and the policy owner. And then the policy and policies defines the policy author role. Now, the policy owner might be the author. And this does happen a lot. But a lot of times the policy owner delegates a subject matter expert to write the policy. And so that's why we separate these roles out, even though the policy owner might be the policy author as well. But in the case of Barbara that I was referencing, she had the role of policy program manager, policy owner, and author of that policy and policies. But her role is just the policy program manager for the other policies in the organization. The policy author role collaborates to ensure all necessary input, drafts the policies using the approved templates and style guide, follows the established development process, and confirms that each policy addresses identified obligations. Now, again, the policy on writing policies needs to clearly define these different roles. On the next slide, we're going to expand this and look at the other roles in the organization. Now, these are all roles that should be on that policy steering committee. You have the role of corporate compliance and ethics itself, where the compliance department provides oversight and accountability by ensuring that policies are adhered to, monitoring for actions of non-compliance, and overseeing actions to correct them. That's the role of compliance that should be on that policy steering committee. And that role of compliance should be defined on the policy and writing policies. You have the role of legal. Legal provides the regulatory guidance to the organization and ensures that incidents are investigated and resolved in a way that reduces risk and liability to the organization. And again, legal should be clearly defined in the policy and policies and their role and should be a part of that steering committee. You've got the internal audit role that provides the independent and objective assurance that policies are followed across the organization. Operational audits routinely include policy conformance. Human resources, think about it. Policies are read by people. Who manages the people of the organization? The employees, that is, human resources. HR has a critical role on the policy steering committee and should be clearly defined in the policy and policies. HR professionals not only ensure that policy adherence is covered in employee training and communication programs, but also that compliance is included in job descriptions, annual reviews, and performance evaluations, and policies are part of that. Then you have the role of investigations and reporting. Investigations and related systems such as hotlines provide insights into whether policies are being enforced and show that the organization takes policies seriously. Insight from investigations can tell us how policies are understood and operating. And then you have the line of business itself, and they have a critical role in making sure that policies apply to the business out there in the line of business where business happens. So here, policies are lived out in the business operations and processes. It's where the rubber meets the road in aligning the existence of policies with everyday organizational behavior. Effective policies protect an organization and its operations without unnecessarily inhibiting them. And the line of business should have a role in the policy steering committee and be clearly defined in the policy and writing policies. Next slide, please. So in this context, that policy and writing policies, should be approved and supported by executive management. The policy and writing policies are responsible to bring integrity and value to policy management. It provides accountability to policy management processes that are often scattered across the organization and defines a consistent policy management lifecycle. It enables policy management to work in harmony across functions, delivering efficiency, effectiveness, and agility across departments of corporate compliance and ethics and legal and IT and accounting and finance and human resources and other roles. And the policy and writing policy provides a well-governed structure for written policies that are written in a way that can improve performance, produce predictable outcomes, mitigate risk, and avoid incidents and loss in the organization. Next slide, please. So some key elements on the policy and writing policies is to be able to define, what the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities are, scope of what is being governed by the policy and policies, that meta policy. And we'll talk about that in the next slide in just a minute when we talk about what a policy is versus a procedure. It gives definitions of governance documents and SOAR resources, provides the structure and content of what should be in a policy, what should be in a procedure, what should be in a standard, format and style requirements, and do we use the Oxford comma? How do we use headings? Use the active voice over the passive voice. The policy on policies defines that the core template for managing policies. The requirement to be able to properly index and catalog, so we have a master record of what all the official policies are of an organization. And provides the overall policy lifecycle framework for the policy governance rules for creation, approval, retirement, updating maintenance, and managing exceptions to policies, and the role of audit and assurance. The policy on policies actually intersects and supports other documents, like a style guide. How do you write policies? What's the language style and format that you use, like using the Oxford comma, using gender neutral writing and policies, things like that. That all gets defined in the style guide. There's the related document templates for writing policies, implementation plan on building out how do we implement this policy in the organization, writing a clear executive summary, and how do we manage exceptions and exemptions to policies and the template for that as well. All those are different types of resources that gets linked and referenced in the policy on writing policies. So next slide, please. So one of the things that's important in the policy and policies is to define what a policy is versus the standard, procedure, or even a guideline. Now, a policy and a guideline are very similar documents. It's just the different tone and approach to the document. A policy is, you will do this, while a guideline is, you should do this. A guideline is permissive by nature, while a policy is more black and white. And so that's sort of the difference between a policy versus a guideline. Now, it gets more confusing when you talk about policy, standards, and procedures. A policy provides the why, the high-level statement. You will use strong passwords on business-critical systems. That's a policy. The standard might tell you that a strong password is 30 characters long and changed every 24 hours and comes from 10 different character sets. That's the standard. The procedure tells you how to configure that password in the Windows environment or the SAP environment or the Oracle environment or whatever environment it might be. And so there might be multiple procedures related back to one policy. Policies and procedures should always be different documents because the procedure changes every time a technology changes, every time a business process changes, while the policy itself doesn't necessarily have to. Now, it gets more confusing though on policies and standards. I come across some organizations that try to strip out policies and standards into separate documents. It often becomes very confusing then because you have a lot of cross-reference hyperlinked documents. And as soon as I read that policy that says policies shall be, you shall use strong passwords on business critical systems, the natural reaction is, what's a strong password? So I find a lot of organizations that combine and integrate policies and standards into the same documents, but they separate policies and procedures into different documents. But the policy and writing policy should clearly define what a policy is, what a standard is, what a procedure is, and what a guideline is. Next slide, please. That meta policy, the policy and writing policies, should aim to provide consistency and usefulness of policies, to make sure that policies are consistently written in the right language, style, and tone of the organization, that they're accessible, that they're writing them at the right reading level of the audience, but also accessible for different geographic and language needs and cultural needs. That there's integrity, that it's easy to find the source, that the authoritative policy at any given moment, that we're not relying on out-of-date information, and the policy that we have is the one that was from 5 years ago and not today. It should be usable and measurable. You want the employees to be able to say the policies and procedures align with my job and are written in a language I can understand, consistently use terms, formatting, and the level of detail help me produce the expected results. This is what the goal of the policy and writing policies is. And in the next slide, which we'll move to now, we talk about the style guide. Now, the style guide is separate from the policy and writing policies, but the policy on policies defines, authorizes, and establishes that style guide. And so while they're separate documents, they're related because the policy on policy should refer to and authorize that there is a style guide. And I've got example style guides as well. And here's the example of a high-level piece of a style guide. The summary, this guide provides you with simple yet comprehensive quick reference tools to understand the choices that the company has made to help you achieve consistency in language, style, and format of our corporate policies and procedures. It intentionally does not cover every grammatical rule or situation that can arise as you write, but highlights the basic structure, language, and definitions we consider most important to achieve a consistent look and feel among our publications. The ultimate goal is to help you write reader-centered documents that drive the correct action. That's the summary of a style guide. This particular style guide in my templates and resources is broken down into 5 sections. 1, principles of style for policies, procedures, and guidelines, which is straightforward principles for good writing of policies. Section 2, formatting and layout of policies. Section 3, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Like I'm a big advocate of the Oxford comma. Section 4, commonly misused and misunderstood words. And then quick reference tables. Next slide, please. Now, the policy and writing policies clearly defines the policy management life cycle. How do we determine the need? When do we write a policy? No, step number 1. And then the policy management life cycle determines and guides who can actually write and approve the policies. And how is that managed? That develop and approve stage. And again, this is going to be different for different types of organizations. There's not a one size fits all. You need a suitable and scalable system. But the policy and policies defines when we need a policy and how do we develop and approve the policy. Once it's approved, how do we communicate and train the policies out to the employees? How do we monitor and enforce the policy? The policy and policy gets out there and talks about how exceptions and exemptions are managed on policies, how do we monitor violations and enforce the policy in the environment. And then the policy on writing policies also defines that measure and maintain. How do we keep policies current in the environment? Now, the best practice out there is that every policy is maintained on an annual basis so that we review all the elements and metrics around a policy, such as regulatory change and business change and number of policy violations and incidents and issues, questions being asked on the policy, and all these other resources, and determine if this is still the right policy for the organization. Now, that's best practice to review every policy on an annual basis. That's a lot for some organizations. And so I've interacted with many organizations that tier it. High-risk policies are reviewed every year, medium-risk policies every 2 years, and low-risk policies every 3 years. But whatever cycle you have to maintain your policies, it needs to be clearly defined in the policy and policies and adhered to. Next slide, please. From there, the policy on writing policies is the first step before authoring policies. When we talk about a collaborative process for writing policies, the very first step is to establish a policy and policies that sets templates, style guides, and development process. From there, we determine the need for a new policy. Step 3, we draft the policy with input from relevant subject matter experts, and we go back we go to number 4, we review new or edited policies to ensure compliance, and we might go back to 3 for further drafting. And finally, it attains final sign-offs and approvals. Now, the policy and policies we establish in step 1, but the policy and policies guides steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 of this whole process and provides the framework for that. Now, in conclusion, on the next slide, if the whole focus of a mature policy management program that is encapsulated and defined and documented in a policy and policies should achieve the following 10 objectives. Policy management done properly should help us reliably achieve business objectives, whether they're entity, division, department, process level objectives. Policies help us reliably achieve business objectives. Policies help us mitigate risk and uncertainty, define and guide the organizational culture, increase stakeholder confidence, prepare and protect the organization while preventing, detecting, and reducing adversity and weakness. It motivates and inspires desired conduct, provides consistent processes and behavior, improves responsiveness and efficiency, and optimizes economic return and value. Final slide here. So in that context, we definitely need the policy and writing policies and be able to manage this in the organization. My job is research. I'm an analyst. I don't like to refer to myself as a consultant, although I do advisory in a certain capacity, but a lot of my clients are even the big consulting firms. But my job is research. And so I interact and particularly define, what are the strategies people are looking for policy management and other compliance processes, and how does technology automate and enable that? It differentiates, what technologies are better served for what purpose. And so I get involved in a lot of RFPs and interactions out there on policy management and other areas of compliance like regulatory change and things like that. So that's a little bit about what I do. And I appreciate your questions, and we'll move on to a Q&A format in just a few minutes. But before we get into that, Danny from ClauseMatch is going to talk about what ClauseMatch is doing to help organizations with their policy and policies and developing and delivering an efficient and effective and agile policy management process.
Thank you, Michael, and really appreciate you talking us through that presentation today. And I see a lot of questions coming through, so please keep them coming. We're going to come to them in about 5 minutes. I'm going to speak about 2 things today. Number 1, I'm going to speak around what clause match is doing in this space around policy management. Clause match is a compliance solution specifically used around policy management, regulatory change management, and contract management. Today, I'm just going to focus on the policy management side of things. I'm also, a number of questions have come in around what are we seeing from other organizations right now, given the unprecedented times, how are people reacting to this? I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving a few examples of some stories from the last couple of weeks. Specifically, I'm going to speak around some large financial services firms and what we've heard from them and what we've seen them doing. So number one, clause match in a policy management space. We're seeing a huge demand right now around what I call the policy house. This is around how to ensure that there is one consistent area to manage that full repository of policies within the organization. I'll talk about a bad example we heard in that area today, this week recently. The second area is around policy editing, reviewing and reporting. So largely what we talked about in today's session, clause match is specifically used in this area by a huge number of organizations. And I'd say number one we're seeing right now in the market is company communication is the number one thing every company is focused on. Company communication and company well-being, the number one and two. And therefore policy communication and how you're communicating with your employees is critical right now, and clause match also help in this space. And I'll touch on that in a bit more detail in the next slide, please. The two examples that I'd share, so one example was from a large US bank. This was last week, where both the HR or head of HR and the head of compliance both sent out a policy update, which was contradicting each other. So this was something I just heard about in the last week from the bank. They told us this example, which has led to the CEO now demanding a better process around how to deal with their policies. So I'm sure that may not be too unfamiliar in some of your organizations of contradictory or duplication of policies, but that was one example. A European example, European bank, since they moved to a 100% remote workforce, it took them 2 weeks to be able to access, for their teams to be able to access the meta policies that they needed within the organization. So for 2 weeks, a large number of people wasn't able to do their core job, especially at the time that they are updating and communicating new policies and changes to policies due to the current circumstances. I'll give you a third example, one other company. This is they're again a European headquartered financial institution. They were looking at their policies due to what's happening with the remote workforce, and they came across that 60% of their policies have not been updated in the last 2 years, and they have a 1 year internal policy for all policy updates. So a few examples we've heard about in the last couple of weeks right now. What we're seeing in clause match is specifically a high demand coming around the simplification of policies and around how they are created, how they are connected with other regulations, procedures, as Michael talked about. That's really where we're seeing a large area right now. A large number of organizations we're dealing with specifically are looking at the business continuity, the BCP policy, and updating that. And what we've heard from organizations is this has been a real mess as well. And I would also share that a number of these organizations are using their COVID budgets to specifically address areas related to policies and related to policy management. So if you as an organization are dealing with this mess right now, are trying to overcome this and not sure how or who to go and speak to, most organizations now do have a COVID budget, and we're seeing a number of organizations specifically putting some of that budget around company communication to their teams. So that's, I don't want to today spend too much time on what clause match do in this space, but if you're interested, then speak to one of the team around what clause match can help you with related to policy management. And we're going to open that to questions now.
Excellent. Thank you guys very much. So let's spend the last few minutes on some questions from the audience. So the first one is, what is the most important aspect of policy change management process to be supported or implemented by technology? Do you want to go first, Michael?
Sure. So the question is, what is the most important part of the process to be implemented by technology?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, consistency across the process. I mean, to me, that's the foundational piece, is to have a consistent approach to policy management on where policies are, what they are, and the structure template. That collaborative authoring becomes extremely important. It's hard to maintain, just to nail things down, though, because it's not only consistency on the back end of policy management, but also consistency on that front end, and having that consistent portal and access to policies for the employees.
Sure. What is the determinant too lengthy for a policy on policies?
Wow. I mean, regular policies in the organization, I mean, you want to keep as short as possible, but still define and require it. But the policy on policies itself is a very structured document that defines and details the overall policy management process. And so the length of it's going to vary from a small domestic firm to a global, conglomerate. I mean, and so I hate to like pin it down that there's a one size that's appropriate for everybody, because the length of a policy and policies is going to vary depending on the complexity of an organization.
And could you elaborate on the relationship between policy management and risk management? Who drives, who follows?
To me, it's a symbiotic relationship where both are necessary components. I hate to say that one drives and one follows. Because policies are risk documents. The very fact that we have a policy means that somebody's identified a risk. And so, policies are a natural flow out from risk, but policies aren't just about risk. Policies are there to help the organization reliably achieve objectives. Can you imagine, a business without policies? We'd never be able to achieve objectives. They are governance documents. And so I see, several programs calling their policy management program their governance documents program, and at a layer above risk as well. And so to me, it's hard to say that one is over the other, because it's really, to me, a symbiotic relationship.
And is there a front end to policy to make this an easier, more usable entity rather than a plethora of thick documents?
Can you repeat that question once more?
Is there a front end to policy to make this an easier, more usable entity rather than a plethora of thick documents?
There should be. And to me, the portal becomes critically important to be able to have that single portal where policies are not just, a collection of documents, but they're very easy to navigate, and the view into them is appropriate for the role, so that I see the policies that are more critical to my role in the organization, that are more in scope or high risk to my role before the other policies of the organization. And so it's very role dependent and very navigable and customizable. Might have elements of gamification, which, I could have my, corporate avatar of my role in the organization. And if I complete my policy tasks, I get my little ethical employee merit badge, or my privacy merit badge, or health and safety, or IT security and things, elements of gamification and engagement to be able to ask policies. All these become very important, even using of cognitive technologies and things like geolocation and things, where if I land in some country that's known for bribery and corruption, as soon as I get there and my phone and mobile app turns on, it says, "Oh, we see you just arrived in such and such country. There's a high risk of bribery and corruption in this part of the world. You need to review the gift, entertainment, and expense policy," or whatever it might be. Or be able to ask questions on policies. What was the policy? What can I give? What amount of a gift can I give to individual or entity? And have that Siri or Alexa type functionality that goes and finds and delivers that information back. The portal is becoming very interactive and engaging now.
Also, Lois, it's worth saying that I guess years ago, policies were single, isolated documents that were updated on a whatever frequency basis your organization adhere to. Now we are seeing the interconnectedness with regulations, with controls, with procedures, and that interconnectedness is making those documents more live and more active than in the past.
Excellent. So I'm going to do two final questions. So is having a policy register mandated into the policy on policies a good idea?
I think it's an excellent idea. I'm encountering organizations that have no clue what policies they have in their environment. I was keynoting at a conference a couple years back, and I asked the question, who in this room has a master index of all your policies? That if the regulator, opposing counsel in a lawsuit, law enforcement, the external auditor, whoever it might be, is saying, show us a list of all of your official policies, that you can produce that. 2 people out of 200 raise their hands. A lot of organizations don't even know what policies they have. And in a time of crisis like right now, this becomes critical. What policies are official policies? Which ones of these needs to be changed temporarily or permanently as a result of this crisis? And which ones need to be maybe not changed, but needs to be communicated, like GDPR and privacy policies in a time of crisis. All these become critical that we have some master index. So yes, there should be a central policy register that is mandated in the policy and policies, no doubt about it.
And the last question, any suggestions on how we can cut down the times and red tapes in establishing a policy?
Definitely. And this is one where Clause Match stands out, where there's only a few others that do something like that. And that is the collaborative authoring of policies, where multiple people can be working on the same policy at the same time. I could be authoring the market conduct policy here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the USA, and somebody in Singapore or over there in London could be seeing the changes on the screen as I make them and be adding their parts and their comments and their edits all at the same time. This is cutting down that time and red tape, because before it could take 6 months to write a policy with all the document check-in and check-out. I wrote the policy, I've got it for 2 or 3 weeks. The next person has to review it and edit it, and they've got it for 2 or 3 weeks. It's a very, very linear process that takes 6 months to write a policy. In today's dynamic business environment, that slows things down and makes the business unagile. Now we're starting to see these solutions like Clause Match that have collaborative authoring, where multiple people can be working on the same policy at the same time with full redlining, editing, and audit trails and system of record down to the individual changes that were made. And workflow and tasks down to not just the document level, but down to the paragraph, section, clause level.
Excellent. Do you want to add anything to that, Danny?
I would just sum up, say there's technology out there now that makes that red tape so much easier. There's also been a number of questions, and we probably haven't had time for in this session, around senior management and how to get senior management on the same journey, how to get approvals, how to prove ROI. So maybe we'll cover that in another webinar, maybe not today, but maybe we'll create another webinar specifically around how to get approvals, how to get management on site to decisions around this topic as well.
Michael, Danny, thank you very much for sharing your insights and knowledge with us today. You will all receive an email later today with a link to the presentation and a link to this recording. Thank you all for listening, and hope you all will join us again next Tuesday.